I think we are ready to kick off the next session. I hope everyone's enjoying today so far. I am delighted to introduce David Taylor, Executive General Manager from our gold sponsor Licella, who we heard from earlier. Congratulations on funding, very exciting. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Shahana, and good afternoon, everyone. Hope you've all enjoyed a lunch and you've had lots of sugar to keep you going, and you make sure you don't hit that slump just after lunch. We've got a great panel of speakers here today to talk to you about driving demand for low carbon fuels. So make sure you really tune in, and if you need to, stand up, make sure you stretch, and make that effort to keep you going throughout the afternoon. Just wanted to, it's great to see some familiar faces here. I haven't seen a lot of people, but it's great to actually touch base with a few people from my past. But it's also great to meet some new people here today. For those who don't know me, David Taylor, Executive General Manager for Asia and Australasia. I look after the growth and development of our asset portfolio across the region. Just like to kick off with an acknowledgement of country. Pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to those First Nations peoples that join us here today. Licella has embarked on its reconciliation journey. We've recently received endorsement from Reconciliation Australia for our first stage of our Reconciliation Action Plan, which we're very, very proud to have achieved, and we're looking forward to lots of engagement as we move forward with our Project Swift. So who is Licella? Very, very briefly, you heard a lot about Licella this morning from Andrea, our General Manager of Stakeholder Engagement and Communications. And what we are really about is pioneering a new technology that has actually been around for a long time, but the innovation that Licella has brought to bear over a number of years to really advance biofuels and biomaterials through our patented CAT-HTR hydrothermal liquefaction technology. Our technology seeks to not only produce the lowest cost SAF in the market, but we're also focused on ultimately bringing a net zero carbon product to the market. And how have we done that over time? When this works, come on. There we go. Technology works. Okay, over a number of years, as Andrea spoke about earlier this morning, we have been developing and using our technology across a number of different projects throughout the world. So this is not a new technology. It's actually been deployed and it's actually been scaled up from the initial commercial demonstration facility, which is based here in Central Coast of New South Wales. So we've got some projects over in the UK that utilise our technology as their core, South Korea, Japan, and now Queensland and Project Swift, which is really the next phase of our scale-up in our project portfolio. We're continuing to look for new opportunities around the world and working with our strategic partners to really deploy that technology at a larger scale throughout the world. Today's session is really about driving demand. We've heard a lot this morning about policy. Lots of people are saying that policy is one of the key drivers for demand, and that's true. But I kind of think of it in a slightly different way. I like to think of it from the customer perspective, and I like to think that the customer is the ultimate driver of demand. People buying this product, why are they using this product? And from my perspective, there's two key things. It's got to be of creating some value for them. And what does that ultimately mean? It means at a price point that is acceptable to the ultimate customer. And that's one of the biggest challenges in terms of demand when we're actually talking about renewable fuels and low carbon fuels. Of course, sustainability also comes into the selection criteria and also why people choose to use low carbon fuels and drive that demand. So I suspect that we'll be talking a lot about this. I had some great conversations during the lunch break and earlier today around value is so important to the actual equation in actually driving demand as well. But then we've got the other side, and that's what's pushing demand. And of course, there's been lots of discussions about policies and mandates this morning. and I'm sure that will continue in our discussions throughout the rest of this week. But there's also demand from investors, and investors are looking for, they're really pushing a lot of the demands through as well to try and bring these products to market. So in that context, I'd like to introduce the range of speakers that we have for you today. First of all, we have Jan Marcus Lückhof from DHL Group. He'll be joining us via video link today. We're very privileged to have Brigadier Mark Baldock here from the Department of Defence. We really look forward to his discussion on Defence Future Energy Strategy. David Bartnik, who's the Head of Innovation at Svitzer Australia, and talking about the marine side of things, so really interested to hear about that. Chloe Davison, thank you Chloe for joining us. We'll be talking about consumer good brands, the book and claim system and demand and aggregation, so thank you for that. And Samuel Parsons is a director of V-Line Corporation. He'll be talking about some of the initiatives that have been put in place. And Ignacio is here somewhere. Great to see Ignacio here and talking about e-fuels from HIF. So without any further ado, let's pass over to Jan Marcus on video connection. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me, even in this pre-recorded form. Unfortunately, I can't be there today in person, so I'm very thankful that it's possible to bring across what I want to say here in this form of a video, and I hope we can engage later via email or calls. Very much open to that if there are any questions or opportunities that we might explore together. So today I want to talk about DHL's decarbonization strategy and our mission towards net zero emissions. My name is Jan Lückhof. I work in the corporate development department of DHL. I'm located in the global headquarters in Bonn, Germany, and I work in a team called Clean Operations Office. That already basically tells you what we do. We are essentially responsible for setting environmental targets for the entire DHL group globally, and we also help our business units in achieving these goals. I myself am responsible for sustainable aviation. This includes a few topics that I look after, but most of my time, maybe 80-90% of my time, goes into sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, and I'll touch upon that a bit more in a minute here. Now, introducing DHL is hopefully not really necessary. I'm sure you all know basically what we do, delivering parcels and letters to your doorstep, but there's actually much more to DHL, so it's a rather large organization. We are up to almost 600,000 employees globally. We are present and active in 220 countries and territories, so essentially all over the world. And we have 5 business units now, which you can see here below. I won't bore you with any details here on the numbers, but just focusing on the very left side here, our Express business unit, because that is the business unit that actually owns and operates our Express network, our aviation Express network, which is comprised of roughly 300 aircraft, and we operate out of 3 global hubs, Cincinnati in the US, Leipzig in Germany, and Hong Kong in Asia. But more than that, we also operate at over 250 airfields worldwide, so we really have a pretty much spread out presence on many airports in the world. Now, coming to our decarbonization journey and our target, it's fairly simple. We want to reach net zero in 2050, as you can see here, coming from a carbon footprint in our base year 2021 of close to 40 million metric tons. That is comparable, for example, to a carbon footprint of a mid-sized country such as Denmark. It's even a bit more than that. So it's a fairly significant footprint for a single company, obviously because we're active in logistics, which is very much fueled by transport activities, and we'll go into that in a minute here. To be honest, a 2050 target is obviously good to have, and that should be our ambition here, but a 2050 target 25 years from now is quite difficult to steer towards in a day-to-day business, right? So it's quite far away. As I said, we'll need that faraway ambition, but we need a goal that is much closer to now to actually steer our daily business. And that's why we also have introduced a 2030 target, so only 5 years away from now. And it's a science-based target, which is validated by the Science Based Target Initiative. And this target requires us to go down to below 29 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent in 2030. And that is true not only for our Scope 1, but also our Scope 3 emissions combined. Now, as you can see here in this graphic, our business as usual without decarbonization would lead us, depending on business growth and such things, to well above 40 million metric tons. So maybe 43, 44 is what we have estimated. So we need to actively decarbonize 13, 14, 15 million metric tons of CO2. And to break that down on our needs in our transport modes is actually what you see here in the middle. So we have committed to a 30% share of sustainable fuels in air and ocean freight and also in road transport. We will need a 60% share of electric vehicles in our pickup and delivery fleet. And all of our warehouses and all of our buildings need to be carbon neutral as well. So this is quite the ambitious target. You've probably seen other airlines coming up with a 10% SAF share in 2030, which is most common. The EU has a 6% mandate in place for 2030. So 30% is well above everything else that we've seen so far, but it's actually just doing the math on what we need to do to be Paris aligned and stay below 1.5 degrees of global warming, if that's possible at all at this point. And you can see here in the upper right corner, our footprint is very much dependent on aviation. So about 2/3 of our carbon footprint is generated in aviation. And that is why sustainable aviation fuels are so important to us. And then the next big thing is road transport with 24%. And this is mainly long-haul heavy-duty trucking, which is also very difficult to electrify. And also there we're going to need liquid fuels in the foreseeable future. And I'll dive deeper into that topic in a minute here. Now on this slide, I want to talk a bit about our options that we have at our disposal to actually achieve the target that we have set ourselves. You know, having a target is great, but we need to do something about it, and we need options to actually reach that target. And this is what we sort of have as a high-level strategic thoughts on that topic here. Now, pickup and delivery, it's fairly simple, fairly straightforward. This is almost everything is going to be electrified, and we are well underway of doing so. We have a 30-35% share of electric vehicles in our pickup and delivery fleet already, and we'll try to ramp that up as quick as possible. On our buildings, it's also relatively straightforward. We can do a lot with green electricity. We are in the process of currently putting a lot of solar on our roofs, on our own buildings. We switched to heat pumps, and also we have quite a few projects now with on-site battery storage just to make more use of own produced green electricity to not rely on the grid as much as before. Now on line haul, you can already see that it's a bit more difficult to decarbonize because there are lots of options. In the long run, we do believe that electrification will play a large role and probably be dominant in that field as well as battery technology progresses. But on the way there, there are a lot of different options that we have. So one is obviously HVO as a drop-in fuel that we can and do use right now. We also have quite a sizable amount of bio-CNG and bio-LNG trucks on the road already. And we are currently also trialing electric trucks with a range extender. So there are few options with advantages and disadvantages depending on the use case, and that is a field where a lot of trials is going on right now, and we'll see if there's any, at least as a bridge technology, any of those that will prevail. Now on ocean, it's also relatively limited in terms of options that we have. I must say that DHL does not own and operate any ships, any ocean vessels, so we don't do that ourselves. It's a purely Scope 3 exercise for us, and we rely heavily on our partners to actually implement those solutions on the ground. But what we do see is that there's a long-term shift towards ammonia and methanol as long-term solutions for fuel, and in the short term it's going to be sustainable marine fuels in terms of biofuels mainly. That's what we see right now, and the race between ammonia and methanol is pretty much on in our view, and we're agnostic to that. Both have advantages and disadvantages, and we'll just see if one of those emerges as the go-to option, or if we'll have both in the end. On aviation, it's pretty much sustainable aviation fuel. So we obviously also do refleeting, we buy new aircraft, we increase the efficiency in the operations, but that can only go so far, and we really need a different decarbonized fuel as a drop-in solution for aviation. Aircraft that are being built and introduced today will still fly in 2050, so that is something that we need to switch to. And there are a few main pathways to produce sustainable aviation fuel that are noted down here, and there are a lot of sub pathways, and we do believe that it's going to be a mix of all of these going forward. Currently, HEFA makes up 95 or 98% of the market. That will change in the future, but it's always going to be a mixture of different technologies in the SAF market. We also monitor the hydrogen and electric aviation market, but to be honest, we have just seen Airbus scale back their plans for hydrogen aircraft. We've also seen other hydrogen startups in aviation fail. There are still some out there, and there might be a niche application in the next few years for some smaller aircraft, may it be electric or hydrogen electric. But this will not replace our heavy-duty freighter aircraft in the next 10 to 20 years. So we monitor that market, but we don't believe that this will make a huge dent in our footprint anytime soon. And then down below, carbon removal, I won't touch on that today very much, just saying that this is also something we monitor, and that is something that we will sooner or later also implement and integrate into our portfolio. But that is a sort of a niche market still, and we closely monitor how that develops and when and how we can step in. Also, honestly, depending on regulation, that is a huge part, and that's still largely unclear to us right now. Now, a bit of deep dive into sustainable aviation fuel and what we have done so far. We believe that we are one of the leading buyers and users of sustainable aviation fuel in the world right now. In 2023, we have bought and used 72 kilotons of SAF, which put us just above 3% of SAF share in our own jet fuel use. And according to our analysis, that was roughly 15% of the global market that we as DHL have bought in SAF, which is quite remarkable, and we anticipate and we actually hope that this share will go down in the future, just with more production coming online. But we believe that we do play a role in kickstarting this market, and obviously want to keep a leading position here. We will publish the numbers for 2024 very soon, and I can already say that they won't be lower than that, so we continue to ramp up our ambition here. As I said earlier, we aim for 30% SAF share in 2030. Now you might have wondered, well, what is that translated into actual volumes? And this is the slide that explains exactly that. We will need, according to our estimation and according to business growth and such, roughly 1.5 million tons of neat sustainable aviation fuel in 2030. Just to put it into perspective, that is more than was produced last year globally. So we are very much reliant on a exponential growth of the sustainable aviation fuel market and a steep ramp up. But we do see some promising signs, and we do believe still that this is possible. But there's a need for rapid growth, and we hope we can play a role in facilitating that. Just giving you a brief overview of the airports that are most important to us. I already talked about our 3 global hubs. There are many more airfields and also smaller hubs that are still quite important to us. One of them is actually Sydney. It's not on here because it's fairly small compared to the others, to be honest. But Sydney is an airport where we do have significant uplift as well. It's a challenge, but also the opportunity in my mind. We need to navigate regulation in all parts of the world, and it's more and more difficult to honestly to keep up with all the regulations and the changes that are out there, different point of views on sustainability and all these criteria in the EU, in Asia, in the US. But it's also an opportunity because we can navigate the incentive landscape as well. We're not reliant on 1 or 2 huge hubs in a single country where we need to stick to local regulations, but we can sort of shift around and make use of all the different opportunities that are out there, which is, it's an effort, but it can be worth it, and that is something that I think is quite unique to DHL as well. Now, this is just to show you what we think in terms of timeline. We do have, of course, spot buys in the short term. We do have mid-term deals, so that is 1 to 2 years, which sort of corresponds also with our jet fuel cycles, purchasing cycles. But what we also do is long-term deals, so that is what we would call 3 years and beyond. It's usually 5 years, 8 years, maybe even up to 10 years. And that's really what's necessary to bring new projects online. They need to go back and to their investors and get financing for their project, and they can only do that with the necessary offtake in place and the revenue certainty. So we think we can play a crucial part in advancing to FID for new SAF projects by offering a long-term offtake, and that is something that we are actively engaged in many discussions right now, and that's where we see our role as DHL as well in advancing this market. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about what we do with our customers. So we're not only buying the aviation fuel for our own use and then deducting it from our own footprint, and that's the end of the story. No, we try to create a product with customer values for our customers. So essentially, with our SAF, we use it in an insetting product called Go Green Plus, and we can sell that to our customers, and it's called a low emission transport service. It's certified SAF, all the proper accounting is in place, and our customers actually take up this opportunity, and we've seen great success with that product now, and we're very happy about that, because it enables us to buy even more SAF, right? So we basically bring in the entire value chain. We take in scope 1 in our own footprint, and we essentially pass down scope 3 to our customers, enabling them to reduce that from their footprint. And there's a willingness to pay for that, and we can make use of that to go back to SAF producers and buy even more SAF. So essentially what we always say is our customers' willingness to pay and to purchase Go Green Plus today will enable the SAF production of tomorrow, because we can then generate and signal even more demand to the market. And that's a very integral part of our SAF strategy as well. I hope that gave you a bit of an insight into what we do at DHL, what our ambition and our target is, and what we do right now and what we plan in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. Please feel free to use my contact details. Send me an email, send me a message on LinkedIn if you have any questions, if you have any remarks or offers that you might have for potential collaboration. We are always happy to explore that. And again, thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
First of all, hats off to Jan. If anyone's tried to pre-record themselves using PowerPoint like that, very hard. So if you want some practice, I had to do it recently for an academic course. Try it, and you'll see just how difficult it is. Ladies and gentlemen, everyone, good to see you all, even though I'm looking at the darkness. I'd like to thank Bioenergy Australia for inviting me here today, and everyone else that's taken the time out of their busy schedule to come along. These events are very powerful, and I'm keen to, because I'm new in the job, I'm keen to meet as many people as I can. Defence has been able to break some of the shackles of communication of late with the publishing of some documents, which I'll take you through today. But by way of introduction, I'm responsible for the provision of fuel, oil, lubricants to everything that flies, drives and sails. I don't do anything with regards to estate. However, if anyone has any questions regarding defence and estate, then please, I can take them and pass them on to my colleague, Gabby Follett. If you met Gabby before, that's where she's gone off to. Just want to say up front that we have commenced our journey to accelerate clean energy adoption, initially through the use of low carbon fuel. So it'll be low carbon fuel heavy discussion today, but that fits the theme of today. I will say that Defence's bottom line is not profit, it's about capability. So we will do everything we do to maximise capability. That is for our warfighting, our deployable assets. We're seeking to improve fuel security to go along with the messaging, and then the advantages of emissions reductions as well. And the last thing I'll talk about is remaining interoperable with our key allies and partners as they undertake this journey with us as well. I'd also like to point out that my slides aren't as nice as everyone else's. I'm not a PowerPoint ranger, I'm sorry. All right, but let's get into it. International Renewable Energy set a few years back that the transformation taking place in energy markets will, and I apologise for reading this because I don't want to get it wrong, it will alter the global distribution of power, relations between states, the risk of conflict, and the social, economic and environmental drivers of geopolitical instability. Some states will emerge as renewable powers, where others will become unstable from their inability to transform. Now that's pretty hard-hitting when you think about it. It's take action or wilt, effectively. Geopolitics, and I won't go too high on this, and national power, but national power is derived from many aspects, military and economic being two of those, and diplomatic efforts is another one. When you think about where energy security sits in there, it is an economic issue, it is a military issue, therefore it's a diplomatic issue. So what we're talking about today is very, very, very important. It's widely known that Australia has fuel security vulnerabilities, predominantly stemming from its 90% reliance on imported crude and refined product. And that's one of my key messages today, is that from a defence perspective, we are seeking to reduce that as best we can, that reliance. So it was really nice to hear the advancements in bio-refining that were briefed before, but I'll be very blunt and selfish and say, from a defence perspective, we want that on Australia. We're not a big user of fuel in Australia. We only use 1% of the fuel that is used in Australia. We are the government's biggest user, and therefore the government's biggest emitter as well. 75% of our fuel used is jet, 20% for the Navy, so marine diesel, and 5% for Army. So you think the biggest service uses considerably less fuel than every others, and so on. It's very important for that percentage to understand why low carbon liquid fuels is our focus at the moment. So would you ask, is defence influential in how the market is set? I would say it is, very much so. We have a fuel problem in Australia with regards to where our fuel is, and it's been mentioned a couple of times today. My biggest problem right now is how do I sustain the operation of northern air bases in remote areas, places like Exmouth, the Cape of York, Darwin, Tyndall. You can quickly realise the laydown of industry and how that's actually really hard to achieve, and that's what we're seeking to improve for defence. And part of that solution is the use of biofuel, low carbon liquid fuel and so on. All right, some of the policy. On the left-hand side, general defence policy on climate change. I won't dwell on that too much. On the right-hand side, the Defence Strategic Review and the National Defence Strategy, both publicly available documents. You can download these. Please have a read. Talks about how defence is to accelerate clean energy, plus improve fuel security and so on. So that's basically what I'm told to do by my bosses going forward. We have developed the Future Energy Strategy, and our partners in one of the other departments, and I will say that there are 19 groups and services in defence. That's how big it is. They've developed the net zero strategy. So think one for a state and one for things that fly, drive and sail. So down the bottom, we have developed the Clean Energy Acceleration Plan. Now this is still going through the government approvals at the moment, so I can't get any details on this one, but certainly it's how we're going to get after not only the purchasing of low carbon liquid fuels to drive demand up, but also to incentivise our investment in industry. Now, hopefully someone will ask me a question about why we can't do that now. I don't have time to go into it, but certainly there are restrictions on how we can spend our funds going forward. So the Future Energy Strategy was announced by Minister Conroy on the 20th of October 2024. So you can read that as well. That's on public source information, so one of our open websites. But at the bottom, you can't access the Clean Energy Acceleration Plan until we get it approved. I've been told to go back to government this year with our plan, so that's why we're developing it right now. The key one for the Future Energy Strategy that maps out when defence thinks, now it's based on research and subject to change, certain energy types will be advantageous to our energy mix going forward. We all understand right now that it's low carbon liquid fuels, but that doesn't discount us looking into others as well. So what are we doing so far? We initially used SAF in 2012 as part of a wider US Navy, 2012, got it right the first time, as part of our US Navy wide exercise called RIMPAC, which is held in the vicinity of Hawaii. We've used it since then in that same exercise. But in Australia, we use the, everyone's probably seen the RAF roulettes, the air display team. They flew on SAF last year at the Newcastle Air Show, which then has led to us to start a pilot activity at RAF Base East Sale. Now, East Sale is it's a couple of 100 kilometres to the east of Melbourne. It is the airfield that we do the most amount of refuels every day. They're only small aircraft, but they do the most amount of refuel transactions of any of our air bases in Australia. Now, that blend's a 5% blend, and we're working with our partners to get that fuel in, but it is still coming from overseas. What we've also done is that we've used renewable diesel in a Navy vessel, a Sycamore, you can see down the middle there. It's not a great photo, hence my comment before about PowerPoint skills. And that seemed to work well, and so therefore Navy is seeking to broad and do more trials. This year, exercise Taliban Sabre will be the biggest version of that exercise, held in Queensland middle of the year. We seek to use both renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel in that exercise. All right, we've stood up a dedicated energy transition office. Some of you in the audience have already been in contact with the likes of Andy Weir and Ben Parr and a few of the other staff that work with me. And they're getting after all of those on the left-hand side. Policy direction is something that we're advocating for. We don't set targets as yet, but we are talking about potentially setting targets. And if we do anything, we want to do it in alignment with other key users as well, to maybe drive a central message as well. I do appreciate the power of defence setting targets, and if you know anything about a military officer, nothing's more dangerous than a military officer with a target. That can be taken many different ways. But certainly it's something that we're talking about. We haven't set targets yet though, so we're still net zero by 2050. Also, I mentioned before, the Future Energy Strategy has been published so we can get out and talk in these forums a little bit more freely. So please grab me in the break if you can. I'm happy to discuss things, and I'm happy to answer a lot of questions going forward in the panel about anything that you may wish to discuss. Lastly, I just wanted to remind everyone why we're doing it. It's for fuel security. It's to reduce our reliance on the importation of fuel. We all know what could happen if those lines of communication can be cut. So therefore, we're trying to drive up demand and use of renewables in Australia to drive growth. Now, please, someone asked me the question in the panel about how we can do that, because that is a very interesting topic and something that I'm trying to bust through from a departmental perspective. Okay, the little red clock's gone red, so that means I need to sit down. I do appreciate the use of the bell. Normally in defence you just get yelled at to sit down, but the lady said that they would do that just to make me feel at home as well. But certainly keen to meet you all, keen to discuss more in the panel, and thank you for your time.
It's going to be a hard act to follow. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. David Bartnik, Head of Innovation at Svitzer Australia. I'd also like to thank Bioenergy Australia, not just for the conference here today, but also for all the great work they do throughout the year in developing policy and advocacy, for the sector. Let's see if we can make this work. I believe I'm the only speaker today from the maritime sector, so I thought I'd take a minute or two to give you a brief outline of shipping's importance to the Australian economy. 99% of the volume of trade in and out of Australia is carried on a ship. That's about 80% by value. There are more than 6,000 ships making over 30,000 port calls around the country, and as a curious fact, you may be interested to know that only 4 of these ships are Australian flagged. Due to shipping's long history and independent legal standing, it's probably unique amongst all transport sectors in having an industry body, the International Maritime Organisation, that has the power to make and enforce laws across all ships that travel between international ports. The IMO has set emissions reduction targets for global shipping in a bid to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 and has enacted measures to ensure compliance, including financial and other penalties. On the domestic front, there are over 30,000 so-called domestic commercial vessels, or DCVs, collection of ferries, tourist vessels, fishing boats, offshore oil and gas support craft, and of course harbour craft like pilot boats, dredges and tugs. Apart from the safeguard mechanism that would only apply to a small percentage of Australian craft, there are no emissions targets for DCVs. I suspect most of you have probably never heard of Svitzer, so I'll give you a brief introduction. We're a global towage service provider with headquarters in Copenhagen, and since we demerged from Maersk in April last year, our shares have been listed on the NASDAQ. Svitzer has over 450 tugs and other vessels in 141 ports around the world. Australia is a major focus, with the largest towage provider in the country, with 120 vessels in 27 ports in capital cities, regional and resource terminals. With over 900 crew members, Svitzer is the largest private employer of seafarers in Australia, and our breadth of operations within Australia and overseas gives us probably a unique perspective on the maritime supply chain. If you see a burgundy, blue and green tug out the window on your way to work, it's one of ours. Svitzer has 2 very ambitious decarbonisation targets: a 50% reduction in intensity by 2030 and to be fully carbon neutral by 2040, a decade ahead of the IMO targets. The baseline year for that is 2020, which is actually a bit unfortunate for us here in Australia. as we started the journey on decarbonisation a couple of years before the rest of the company, and we've probably already picked up some of the low-hanging fruit before that 2020 baseline. To meet these targets, we have a strategy based essentially on three elements: behaviour, the way our tug masters operate the tugs when we're not under pilot's orders; equipment, which is implementing new, more efficient and low-carbon technologies into our fleet; and fuel, how we power our new and existing fleet with low-carbon alternatives. So with these ambitious targets, how are we doing? We're proud of some of the successes we've had so far, with a 24% reduction in global carbon intensity in 2023 over the 2020 baseline. Focusing initially on modifying behaviour to encourage more fuel-efficient operations, since 2022 we've spent a lot of time introducing new, internally developed technical innovations and low-carbon fuels into the mix. The stellar standout performance in 2023 was due primarily to the EcoTow initiative in the UK, under which we powered most of our fleet of 80 or so tugs on hydrotreated vegetable oil, or HVO. Since then, we've continued to work with our OEM engine suppliers to introduce greater blends of fatty acid methyl ester, or FAME, culminating in the current usage of B80 for our tugs in Amsterdam. And we've done a lot of work with those OEMs to get approval to use those fuels in their engines. We're currently in the process of building our first battery electric methanol hybrid tug. It's a bit of a mouthful. That's going into Gothenburg in Sweden. That'll have a 6.3 megawatt hour battery. And we're building a second battery-powered tug for the Öresund Strait between Sweden and Denmark. We also have projects for the electrification of the auxiliary power requirements of our existing fleet, which account for around 10% of our total fuel usage. It hasn't always been smooth sailing though. It's a bit 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, and the demise of our HVO supplier in the UK has left us scrambling for other decarbonisation options to fill the gap. The soon-to-be-released 2024 numbers will show a significant increase in carbon intensity over 2023, so we're actually going to go backwards. And things don't get any easier for there. I don't know how many of you are familiar with marginal abatement cost curves. It might be something you've seen in other presentations. Essentially what you have, they provide an excellent perspective on the challenges of decarbonisation. The horizontal axis shows the tonnes of CO2 emitted by our various operations in Australia, and the vertical axis shows the current estimated cost of eliminating those emissions in US dollars per tonne. Most of the initiatives we've focused on so far have been at the bottom left of the chart, where the abatement cost is actually negative, i.e. we save money by reducing fuel consumption. To progress past a 10% reduction in carbon intensity, we have to start addressing the areas to the right, where the abatement cost is obviously much higher. The challenge for us over the next 15 years, and particularly over the next 5 years to 2030, is to find ways to reduce this cost through technological innovation, commercial partnerships, and external incentives so we can reach our target of net zero by 2040. There's a blue line on the slide you may have noticed. That is actually the cumulative cost of abatement. I haven't included a scale on this, but the total cost of abatement using currently available technology and fuel sources is roughly comparable to the total profit that we make here in Australia. So it's unlikely to happen. Not with these numbers anyway. So what does ideal look like for Svitzer? What would we look for in a perfect world? Here's a brief wish list of the things we need for a low carbon future. You see my little heart slide. Look, bipartisan federal support for low carbon fuels would be an excellent start. But given the toxic political history around carbon pricing in this country, we appreciate that is unlikely. What might be possible, however, is to get agreement on the mechanism for a market-based incentive scheme and leave the major parties to argue about the price. That way, at least we'd have some degree of policy certainty or regulatory certainty, and it would be easy for voters to judge the impact of changes to that price. We see a robust, transparent and well-enforced certification regime as critical to ensuring a level playing field. A number of speakers have talked about this. We believe it should be compatible with similar certification schemes overseas, particularly in Europe, obviously for our benefit with a Danish parent. We'd love to see a vibrant ecosystem of viable biofuel projects, i.e. all of you out there, which would give us diversity of supply and help minimise transport costs. So far, we've struggled to persuade customers to pay a premium for low carbon towage services, though we have recently partnered with HIF Autoliners in Australia to provide the first near zero carbon towage operations in Australia. Hopefully that's a trigger for further interest in that area, but on itself, in isolation, it's a fairly small contribution. Flexible powertrain technology and multi-fuel capability will be critical for us to arbitrage the cost of different fuels and minimise the risk of being left with stranded assets. We're in a different situation to ocean-going vessels in that between our duty cycles we can actually have the time to recharge our tugs. But with a typical asset lifetime of 30 plus years and the prohibitive cost of retrofitting powertrains, total fleet renewal is unlikely to happen before 2050. So low carbon biofuels are going to be critical if we're to have any chance of achieving net zero by 2040. Just moving on to some of the implications for the bioenergy sector. I guess in some ways, Svitzer's a bit of a canary in the decarb coal mine. Our ambitious targets mean we're currently facing issues that most of our peer companies may not face for 5 to 10 years. One thing that has become clear to us is that companies will not risk their commercial viability in the quest to decarbonise. So creating a level playing field is critical. BP's recent strategy reset is yet another example of this fact. In the absence of any federal schemes to incentivise low carbon liquid fuels, we believe targeted industry or localised incentives are most likely to level the playing field to drive demand for biofuels, and we're starting to see a glimmer of hope in this area. It's not the most economically efficient way to encourage emissions reduction, but we'll take whatever we can get. I've talked a bit already about the emerging multi-fuel strategy, which is probably the most significant fuel development in the maritime sector since the steam age. The risk for biofuel supplies is that the competitive landscape will become more complex and dynamic. Offsetting that is the fact that engines being built now are unlikely to be scrapped for 20 or 30 years, providing a long-term potential market for biofuels. I'll conclude on this note. I believe that the Australian maritime sector generally wants to decarbonise. The question is, how do we persuade regulators to create the right policy framework for that to happen? Thanks for your time and attention. I'm happy to answer questions later.
Well, I just wanted to say how happy I was to see that there was a dedicated section of this conference to talk about demand. Because when we talk about biosolutions, there's a lot about talk about supply, and I find not enough talk about demand. But just as with developing any new market, both are just as important, just like a chicken and the egg question. There's no point in us growing demand if we're not growing supply, and there's no point in us growing supply if we're not growing demand. And when I talk about demand, I mean demand that's willing to pay the premium and demand that is not just written in commitments, but written in contracts. So my name is Chloe Davison. I'm a partner at Glaze Sustainability, a boutique consultancy that specialises in decarbonising supply chains. And not only do I have the privilege of working with clients to tackle those hairy problems of decarbonising suppliers in Scope 3, but I myself, you could say, was the client, where I was Global Director of Sustainability for Moose Toys, one of the largest toy companies in the world, right behind the likes of Lego, Hasbro, and Mattel. I brought along a little toy today. And if you have any kids, you'd be familiar with the likes of the Bluey toy, who falls into Moose Toys' remit. And so my role included anything from decarbonising materials, factories, warehouses, transportation, offices, really like most internal sustainabilities, anything and anything under the sun. And today I wanted to share my experience decarbonising a consumer goods supply chain and how consumer goods companies can play a role in creating demand pull for these biosolutions, and also the importance of book and claim and buyers' alliances in creating that demand. So To properly understand demand, we need to step into the shoes of the consumer, and in this case, we'll be discussing consumer goods companies. So for a consumer goods company or a product company, the majority of their emissions, 90 to 95%, sometimes more, actually is associated with the product. Employee travel, employee commutes fall into this other category that is almost insignificant. So you can break that 90 to 95% down into 4 big slices. One, to do with the materials that that product is created out of, the emissions from the electricity used at the manufacturers, warehouses, retailers, and in the case of electronic goods, the users themselves. The emissions, on-site emissions, of building and process emissions at those sites, and the transportation of those goods between those sites. Now, unless you're a giant in the game of consumer goods, the reality is that you outsource your supply chain. And outsourcing means you don't own, and thus you don't control the decarbonisation of those assets. And so if this is the makeup of a typical consumer goods emissions profile, it means that the vast majority of their emissions are outside of their control, despite thousands of consumer goods companies committing to SBTi-aligned net zero targets. And in an age of greenwashing being brought to the courts, that is a scary reality for many consumer goods companies. Now, the first slice of the pie, their materials, can be relatively dictated by the product company. But when it comes to electricity, when it comes to the other 3, it's much further from their control. For electricity and building and process emissions, typically where they're coming from manufacturers and warehouses, you have a strong enough relationship there with your supplier that you can effectively influence those suppliers, and there's healthy enough market in the competition, healthy enough competition in the market for you to swap to another supplier if that supplier isn't willing to go along with that decarbonisation journey. However, it's a different game for transportation. Transportation is more of an oligopoly, and so therefore the consumer good brands have little to no influencing power, at least solo, to influence the transportation and freight companies to decarbonise at the rate those consumer goods companies need. There's also, to make matters harder, most consumer goods companies, a lot of them will work through freight forwarders, so the lack of relationship and loyalty means essentially eliminates any ability to influence those carriers. And even if those green services are being offered, they're usually limited, and the geographical and time constraints limit a product company's ability to actually use those services. So you could say, how could a product company have some sort of control over how they can decarbonise this last slice of the pie, with, remember, as little resources as possible and disrupting BAU as little as possible? That's really where the importance of book and claim comes in. Book and claim can transform the hardest slice of the pie to decarbonise for a consumer goods company into the easiest slice of the pie to decarbonise, particularly from a resource perspective. So a product company can pay for the green premium associated with green fuels that are being added somewhere in the market. They in turn receive the inset credit. They can claim, in theory, which we'll discuss in a second, in theory claim those emissions reductions, and without actually needing to move their product using that fuel. And we've seen the success of this. I think sometimes we forget this. We've seen the success of this system in the power sector, whereby large corporate buyers have really driven the development of large-scale renewables through the likes of PPA, where a company is essentially paying for the green electrons to be added to the grid, in turn receive the credits, be able to claim 100% renewable energy without actually, while using a mix of green and brown electrons at their site. So what we're really looking for in this fuel sector for the book and claim is no different to what the power sector has already established. And for a consumer goods company, the credits that are available on the market, you can purchase them today, as we saw with DHL, for your air freight. You can also purchase them for your sea freight, but not, however I might be in a second proven wrong, for road and rail. And we can also see a growing list of providers that consumer goods companies can purchase from, anything from the fuel providers themselves to the service providers like DHL, and we even see carbon management software companies like Watershed now offering their customers to be able to purchase SAF credits directly from their platform, essentially outsourcing the due diligence process to the likes of Watershed. But the problem with the current book and claim system is, one, first and foremost, SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol dictate that these credits actually cannot be used to count towards emissions reduction, unlike its electricity counterpart. Secondly, the internal sustainability teams of these product companies are highly under-resourced, and they don't have the resources or the depth of knowledge to do a sufficient due diligence and procurement process for these credits. And the credits that we see on the market today simply fall short of the emissions reduction that we eventually need to see, so that 90% reduction target. So really, how do we tackle the problem of insufficient resources internally, as well as insufficient abatements for the fuel? That's where buyers' alliances come in, and where you can outsource that procurement process and ushering new fuels that are sufficient in abatement. And Zemba is an excellent example of this. So they are the Zero Emissions Maritime Buyers Alliance, where they've got together cargo owners, aggregated their demands for these maritime inset credits, and then gone to the market with a tender for multi-year offtake commitments for near zero emission shipping fuels. And you can see they've got a multitude of brands that you'd recognise that are participating. They just completed their tender last year, where they had 17 members that signed bilateral agreements, and the winning bid was waste biomethane. They're in the process of doing their second tender. So I've got the QR code there if you wanted to scan it. Highly encourage any cargo owners, fuel providers, carriers to participate. But it's not just those. It's also happening with Saba in the SAF industry. It's happening in the steel industry. And we've also got the likes of NHS, Walmart, and even Canva here in Australia, creating buyers' alliances for their suppliers to purchase from. And so my three key takeaways are, one, One is that demand is just as important as supply. Two, that we need to ensure that these credits can count towards the emissions reduction. And three, that the likes of carriers, cargo owners, and fuel providers need to participate in these demand aggregated tenders and deploy more. Thank you. And I might just, while we're swapping over, I might put that up if anybody wants to go in the QR code.
Shall I start by answering Chloe's question there?
Yeah,
you are correct. We have to demonstrate that renewable diesel goes into our actual trains in this instance. But you're actually incorrect about one thing, which is that inferring that only parents with children or people with children buy bluey toys. So everyone laughed. So just start off by saying thanks for inviting me here today, Bioenergy Australia. It's been quite an interesting deep dive for me, not being a fuel or aviation person, to actually learn so much about zero emissions, essentially, or well, not zero emissions, but low emissions fuels in the aviation sector, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about the rail sector, which I don't think has come up really at all today, which is fascinating. Has anyone here ever caught a V-line train out of interest? Excellent. So I probably don't have to explain as much as I thought I would, but for the people that haven't, okay, so I'm the Director of Sustainability and Environment at V-line. We have a really broad portfolio in my fabulous little team, which ranges from biodiversity to circular economy, to heritage, pollution and contamination, both historical and preventing upcoming events, but also decarbonisation, which is probably the biggest part of what the team does. So, do I have to hold it for a second?
The green one above.
Oh, the other one?
Above.
That top one. Oh, thank you. So who are V-Line? So we are a passenger rail and coach operator in Victoria. And we also maintain all of the rail for all of the freight network across Victoria. We're the largest passenger rail network in the country. We have about 3,400 kilometres of rail. We also operate under a service level agreement as a publicly owned corporation. So we're more like an agency of the Department of Transport and Planning. So which puts us in some interesting commercial positions in how we fund things and how we move forward, which can be both good and bad depending. All of our trains are diesel. We don't have any electric trains, so all of the electrified trains that you might have been on if you've been to Melbourne, they're all run by Metro Trains Melbourne. And all of the trams are run by Yarra Trams. So we have some interactions with those networks, but after Regional Rail Link went through in 2015, a lot of our network was disconnected from, particularly in the west and southwest. In the north, we still have some interactions with the Metro network, northeast and east as well. But a lot of our network now is solely run by just us. We have two main types of trains that run on our network. Our more modern trains called the Velocities, and they sort of came into play in the late noughties, and we're still kind of at the tail end of getting more Velocity trains at the moment, which is interesting. I think someone mentioned earlier around the mining industry, how some of the things that they're still purchasing today have some quite long lifespans. We're still purchasing Velocity trains and they're going to be around for at least 40 years. So we've got about 40 years of diesel trains on our network at least, because they might even be extended. And how we manage that is a really important, how we decarbonise that is a really important thing. We're also facing increasing services. We had a thing called fare cap that happened around COVID time, maybe just after, where all of our daily fares were capped at about $10, so that you can take some pretty long trips for $10. You can go from Melbourne, you can go from the southeast of the state all the way up to the Murray River for just $10 now. So it's brought a lot of people onto our network. As a result, we've had a lot more passengers, a lot more discretionary travel, like outside of peak hour, which has meant that we've responded by putting more services on. We've made trains go from 3-car sets to 6-car sets, etc., which has led to an increase in fuel demand. So, a few facts about us. You can check out here. We have a range of trips from short to long. We have kind of a spider web map of the state with trains going from Melbourne running out to all four corners of the state, and then coach services kind of all over the place, creating that kind of your classic spider web public transport setup. We have 127 3-carriage sets with our Velocity fleet. They can be joined into 6-car. They can join into 9-car now, because a lot of our network can handle 9-car. We have a bunch of classic fleets, such as sprinters and locomotives, where you have like one big locomotive pulling a whole bunch of carriages. We have old and new stations, some of which have heritage value, some of which went in last year. It's a very diverse network, about 3,000 staff. And we also have a lot of supporting vehicles that run on diesel as well. I'm going to jump a bit fast because I'm going slower than I thought I would. So our emissions profile, basically what you can get from that graph is it's all about the trains. We have a small amount of emissions that come from the supporting vehicle fleet, but most of it comes from trains. Almost all of our Scope 1 emissions, small amount comes from our electricity consumption in our Scope 2 emissions, and we're just starting to scratch the surface of Scope 3 right now, which includes our coach services, for example. You can see we're also increasing in our emissions every year, and that's largely due to the increasing services as a result of passenger demand. And if we look at our forecast, which is sort of flatlining based on our current consumption, that will more likely than anything go up, versus our requirements under the safeguard mechanism, which will actually end at 100, but if we look at the 4.9% that we have to do under the safeguard mechanism, we've got some serious work to do in reducing our emissions, which is also very exciting for us, because looking at how we're going to do that is really important. It's really difficult to forecast what our emissions are going to be, but we know that they have to reduce. So what's our plan for that? And this is why I don't like PowerPoint, by the way, because inevitably I do something wrong, which this is the slide, which has something wrong. And it is that the colours don't match up to the right things on the graph. The first thing we're trying to do is to reduce our actual fuel consumption with technology that we can try and then implement. So first one is engine upgrades, and that looks like it says 5%, that should be 2%. So they also, and this has been brought up earlier as well, have some significant improvements to the quality, to air quality in regards to health impacts as well. So we're currently in the R&D stage of that. Actually, we're in the R&D stage for all three of those as I go through them. We're also looking to upgrade our transmission systems, which will have actually a 20%, up to 20% reduction in our fuel consumption. And then the last one is an intelligent engine start-stop system, which is basically a geolocation system that when you group engines together, they currently all run. But now, if we have intelligent engine start-stop in there, it might go, well, we know you're in an area where you can cruise, 7 or 8 of the engines can shut down and only one runs. So there's some, maybe around 5%, maybe as high as 8% savings to be made in that space though. But if you look at it, the big story from that is it's not enough. We can't reduce our emissions enough simply by reducing our fuel consumption. We're always going to have to reduce more. And so what we're doing at the moment is a trial of renewable diesel. It started on the 26th of Feb. It's running until March the 16th, so we're kind of in the middle of it at the moment. Really exciting for us. We actually think it's probably the first one in the country that's been done in passenger rail. So we're working with our fuel provider Viva on that, and it's on the northeastern corridor, which runs to Albury, Wodonga. We're doing the fuelling in the centre of, or not in the centre of Melbourne, in the western side of Melbourne, where we already have a fuelling spot, but we're bringing in trucks. We're doing truck-to-train fuelling. The idea behind that is so that when we then push to say how much can be budgeted to put into renewable diesel moving forward for us, which will need to be at least 4.9% till some of those other initiatives, which might take several years, are in play, we can then say, we've demonstrated that this is fine. This isn't going to blow up our engines, which is the question the CEO asked me on day 2. Have we blown up any engines yet? No, it's just like diesel, except cleaner, and it's going to help Southern Cross Station's air quality. Yeah, we're running 2 velocity 3 carriage sets. The reason why we chose that line is because it is standard gauge, so that trains that go on that line can't run on any of the other lines because their wheels are a bit closer together. That'll be running until the 16th. Following that, we'll be looking to, as I mentioned, introduce at least 4.9% each year if we can. It's around all the commercial side of it now. It aligns with our emissions reduction roadmap. It aligns with our requirements under the safeguard mechanism, and with us aligning with the state government emissions reduction targets, which are zero emissions net zero by 2045, and the interim targets around 2030 as well, if anyone here has looked at the Victorian emissions reduction targets. So moving forward, our goal has been to demonstrate that we can do this, get past that gap, and just demonstrate both to government and to people within the organisation that renewable diesel is a really viable option for us. Thanks.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Ignacio Hernandez. I'm the CEO of HIF Asia Pacific. We are a company that's focused on e-fuels, and we are a developer of these plants around the world. We're not a consumer, so this is the demand section, but I think the angle that I can bring to this is sort of talk a little bit about our target markets, which are very similar to the biofuel space, but we just make the low carbon fuel in a different way. So I'll just quickly take you through what we do, how we do it, and importantly, how we see the market emerging and the demand emerging for our products. Briefly, we are a global developer of e-fuel plants. We have already built a demo scale plant which has been operating for the last couple of years based in Chile. It was about $100 million investment that demonstrates the full operations of the plant, from renewable energy generation through to green hydrogen production, together with a carbon source to make e-Methanol, and then that e-Methanol is converted into gasoline, which we currently are sending to Porsche. Porsche is using it in their Porsche Cup events in Europe. So it's been a fantastic project for us, and it demonstrates that these fuels are actually available now to, along with biofuels, help to provide low-carbon fuels to the market. Aside from that, we're very much focused on developing commercial-scale projects. We have a number of advanced projects. In Australia, we have the Tasmanian project, which is a project we've been developing over the last 3 months. So 3 years. I wish it was 3 months. 3 years. It's a project which is focused on trying to get to the construction stage within the next 2 years. Outside of Australia, we have a large project in the USA, in Texas. We have a couple of projects in Latin America. And we have a team in Europe which is focusing on developing projects in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Briefly, so what do we mean by e-fuels? So this is essentially synthetic fuels. So what we do is we use renewable energy to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and that water, that is then we have green hydrogen being produced. We then need a source of carbon, of CO2. There's a number of recycled carbon sources, biogenic sources, industrial sources, and direct air capture, which is capturing CO2 directly from the air. So once we have green hydrogen and CO2, we have specialized in the methanol pathway, so we can make methanol in almost the traditional way of making methanol. And then methanol can be used as an end product, such as potentially as a marine fuel, which is an emerging market, and it's been discussed a little bit before. Or, like we're doing in Chile at the moment, we can convert it into gasoline. Again, it's an established pathway of methanol to gasoline. Or slightly newer is the methanol to jet fuel pathway. So methanol provides a number of options in terms of the end markets for the products. And each of our projects around the world is making methanol at the moment, so we could actually have the flexibility to cater to the market that develops the soonest, so that we can go forward with the projects. I guess talking about demand, the way that we see low carbon fuels is that and liquid fuels in general, is that we're going to have liquid fuels needed for a long time to come. And when we look at the market, I guess traditionally in these sorts of conferences, we focus on the hard-to-abate sectors. So I think aviation, I suspect 80-70% of the conference so far would be talking about aviation, clearly as a hard-to-abate sector. And we see a big role for low-carbon fuels in that sector. we still expect that even by 2050 there will be a big requirement for fossil fuel, but it's a very big target market for the low carbon fuel sector. Likewise, in the shipping sector, there's really no other solutions for those big ships other than to keep on using liquid fuels. And again, we expect a big opportunity for low carbon fuels, both biofuels and e-fuels. But I think maybe a little bit less sort of talked about is the opportunity within the ground transportation sector. So we're talking about passenger cars or commercial vehicles. And in those sectors, typically the thinking is for cars, you have batteries doing most of the heavy lifting. And in the commercial vehicle sector, that'll be probably the same case, if not a little bit, a few years later. However, we still see, even in these numbers, that by 2050, we probably still need about 20% of the demand of passenger vehicles to be filled by liquid fuels, and a little bit higher on the commercial side. So these are very, very big markets. And one of the themes that I wanted to discuss is sort of what we're seeing in those specific markets today, because I think it's a little bit less talked about. Maybe just to bring the point home, if you look at these charts, by 2050, we essentially still expect about 30% of vehicles to be internal combustion engine driven. So even though we expect, potentially a strong decarbonisation and a switch to electric vehicles in especially the passenger sector, obviously today it's having hiccups in that movement. But overall, the expectation is that there'll be high penetration of electric cars. Having said that, still 22% of those cars by 2050 will be internal combustion engine, or is expected. So there will be internal combustion engines and therefore the need for liquid fuels for a long time to come, and those are very, very big sectors. So when we talk about aviation and shipping, that's great, but this is, from a volume perspective, it's also a very, very big sector. In fact, I think about 6 gigatons of CO2 are emitted from passenger vehicles and light vehicles versus 2 gigatons from the marine sector and the aviation sector today. So it's a very, very big sector. What I wanted to talk about is the markets that we see developing. And essentially, I think the discussion before has been around the voluntary sector. So we've had companies here talking about the decarbonisation plans and how to pass that green premium to consumers, to the customers. We've been mainly focused on the markets where there's actually regulation driving that demand. And for us, we've been targeting the European market for quite a long time, because we see that as sort of the leading market in terms of the thinking and the policies that are being put in place. There are policies around the introduction of e-fuels in the aviation sector. There are policies about introducing e-fuels and mandating the use of e-fuels in the maritime sector. And in fact, in the ground transportation sector, we are seeing a little bit of an initial kind of technology picking in Europe, where they essentially say, look, we think we're going to decarbonise by way of electric cars, therefore we're going to ban internal combustion engines from being registered new ones from 2035 onwards. And what we've seen recently is that that sort of path is not as clear-cut or a straight line as people thought it might be. So what we are seeing now, and this is an example that I wanted to bring here today, is, for example, in Switzerland. In Switzerland, they have an emissions an emission fleet limit and reduction policy on CO2 emissions that until now has been geared towards the using of electric cars, very similar to Australia, what we introduced last year. From this year onwards, car manufacturers can actually meet those emission reduction standards by way of using e-fuels. So that's a new policy. It's just coming to play, and essentially will give OEMs the option to meet the CO2 standards through the introduction of e-fuels. And we think that potentially could be an interesting path for other countries to follow in Europe, and why not here in Australia as well. And similarly, within the broader Renewable Energy Directive 3, which is the EU law which is regulating and driving decarbonisation over there, there is actually a target for 1% use of e-fuels, or RFNBO as they're called in Europe, by 2030 across all sectors. And countries are going through the process of implementing those, taking them from the European level down to the country level. And in doing that, they have some options as to how they apply, in which subsectors they apply. And interestingly, Finland and Romania very recently decided to apply mandates for the use of e-fuels, RFNBO, in ground transportation. So 4% RFNBO usage in Finland by 2030, 5% in Romania. So I just wanted to bring that and sort of show you that there is, I guess, an expansion in terms of what people are thinking and of the tools that can be used to decarbonise as we move forward. The principle of technology neutrality is an important one, and I think recent events in Europe are showing that all tools are needed. So I just leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Ignacio, can you please join us? If I can invite the panel, the speakers back up here for a panel. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. Sorry? 20 minutes? Thank you. Just thought I wanted to keep you on time there. I realise where we're at. A fascinating discussion, and I think refreshing as well to consider the different perspectives across rail, across marine, across defence, and then Ignacio bringing in the ground transportation perspective as well as the mechanisms that are being applied in Europe. I think that was some great insight. Thank you very much, Ignacio. I'll open it up for questions. Obviously, we've got the team going around to ask our panel some questions. I'm sure there's lots of questions for Brigadier Mark. He's got plenty of questions. He invited lots of questions, so take this opportunity to ask him some questions. But I think also, certainly David from Svitzer, there was some very interesting perspectives, I thought, that you brought to the table from a marine perspective that hadn't got much conversation here today. So I think, thank you very much for that. Okay, opening up. There is an app on the back of your thing, so if you've got some questions, fire them up. There's a few in here for DHL. Can't really ask DHL some questions whilst they're not here in the room, but there were some very interesting things that I think, Chloe, you might be able to help with in some of the questions.
Considering I've bought DHL's SAF products before,
yeah,
yes.
Okay, so there was a question around how does DHL's Go Green program work? Wouldn't customers Scope 3 automatically benefit from DHL Scope 1 reductions? Mm-hmm. Or have DHL limited those benefits to paying customers only? So very interesting how the split happens between the actual certificates and the physical fuel. Would you?
Well, typically right now, general units of emissions are being applied. So people would use a general number to say this many miles are flown for our freight and therefore this many emissions. They wouldn't necessarily go to the level of this many miles were flown by a DHL, this many miles are flown by another carrier, and then what are the emissions attributed to each of those. I think when we get a deeper level of accounting, that absolutely, DHL's reduction in emissions would automatically count, but those consumer brands that are wanting to accelerate if SBTI and GHG protocol change their rules, the rate at which they're decarbonising, or maybe they want to decarbonise faster than DHL is as a whole business, then them purchasing those SAF credits through their excellent program would enable them to do that rather than just relying on the pace at which DHL decides to go themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. That's excellent. Brigadier Mark, here's a question for you that's come from the audience. How many times more than fossil jet is Defence willing to pay for SAF? It's a very, very straight up question. I thought you'd be able to give a straight answer.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mentioned it to a few folks at lunch. We don't have shareholders, we have the Australian public, so we've got a different scrutiny on the way that we spend our money. Profit is not our bottom line, it's capability. And the messaging we've given to our pilots, so we've certified all of our jets to 50% blend, even the new Joint Strike Fighter and so on. And it is 2 to 3 times cost, and we are willing to pay that cost to accelerate our blend, but obviously we have set budgets. So therefore, anything that we do to accelerate the costs, we lose somewhere else. So we have to juggle a raise, train, sustain, preparing for conflict budget, and then whatever happens if we do or don't go into a conflict going forward, albeit small or large. So it's a balancing act. But unlike someone mentioned before, one of the presenters, I liked it. I needed to write it down, but I didn't. It was about the bottom line. We're willing to play around with the bottom line a little bit more because our bottom line is different. So we are paying for it now. We've got a 5% blend pilot going on at Rough Base East Sale, which is in Victoria. It is the airbase that does the most amount of refuelling transactions of any airbase in Australia right now. It's all small stuff, small turboprop sort of bits and pieces. And we are looking to take that pilot activity to one of our bigger air bases in, say, Queensland or Northern Territory.
Great, thank you. I'm going to extend that question a little bit further to David. And from your perspective, and you mentioned a great perspective in your presentation about, it has to be commercially viable, and your customers at the end of the day are the ones who are actually, wanting these outcomes, but are they really truly willing to pay for that outcome at the end of the day? So I'm just interested in your perspective. You talked about some great approaches to try and overcome that barrier, because at the end of the day, whether it's a marine fuel, whether it's a SAF fuel, whatever biofuel we're talking about, or low carbon fuel we're talking about, or an e-fuel even, that price point is always going to be an issue of contention from a customer perspective.
No, look, it is a great question, and it's the $64,000 question in our sector. Is that I think in the maritime sector everyone wants to decarbonise, but it's trying to find the party that's prepared to pay for it. And I think we've done quite a bit of work on the R&D side, both with our own equipment in introducing technical innovations, also with the OEM suppliers, and we have done a lot of trials, and in fact, as I said, we've run 80 tugs in the UK on HVO, but that was fundamentally a commercial proposition. I mean, we did that with cost recovery from our clients, and it's fair to say that in the maritime sector, if you go back 2 or 3 years, post-COVID, it was extremely profitable. Container rates had gone through the roof. That's now stabilised. It's come back to sort of the norm now. So there's a lot more focused on cost in the sector. So we're very much, because we listed last year, our shareholders have a greater and greater say in it. So our focus really is on recovering costs from customers. So far, our success there has been limited. There have been some glimmers of hope, and hopefully 2025 is going to be a landmark year for us in that respect, particularly here in Australia.
Great. And Samuel, we've got a question here which also talks about the cost side of things. Can you share what the renewable diesel HVO cost differences are on the pilot, and how you see the cost difference playing a role going forward?
I mean, here in Australia...
Sorry, that's for Sam.
Oh, sorry.
No.
I'll come back to you if you like, David. I can come back to you if you like.
I can't really share the cost difference for the trial at this point, but moving forward, we will be factoring that into whatever budget submissions we put forward to incorporate more HVO into our mix. I'm not sure I made it clear in that presentation, sorry, that we're using 100% in this trial.
Right.
So we basically want to rule out any foreseeable operational or engineering issues. We've had the 100% okayed with the warranties on our engines. So moving forward, it's going to come down to what can we get budget to implement and how much, and having things like the safeguard mechanism and pretty stringent state government targets in particular of 2024 and interim ones is going to really really help us tell that story. But at this point, I can't really share the actual cost.
Or maybe you need a buyer's alliance to drive down that cost.
Sorry, what was that?
Or maybe you need a buyer's alliance to drive down that cost.
Maybe.
Potentially.
Maybe, indeed.
Let's talk.
You brought up an interesting point, and I might, because of Ignacio's experience with Porsche and equipment manufacturers, but it's a broader question for the panel, is how much does the OEM provider, in particular the engines, how much influence do they actually have on the overall demand? Because clearly you've got a risk if the actual fuel's not meeting a certain standard. So Ignacio, maybe I'll start with you and just some of your experiences with some of the customers you've dealt with in how they've influenced the ultimate demand of the fuels that you've been looking to produce.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It really depends on where you're talking about. I think in Europe there is, with these regulations, they're actually taking different paths. So whether they apply to the end consumers, in the case of an airline, whether they apply to the fuel supplier, and also where they apply to the fleets, right? And I think we've seen all of those things happen, right? You have, I was talking about the Swiss case where it's clearly on the OEM. You have on the aviation side where it's more of the fuel supplier. In the maritime sector, it's sort of a combination as well. So and then if you're talking about the ground transportation sector, because there are options, obviously there's a whole another element around, what's the consumer preference in terms of the introduction of different types of powertrains, et cetera, et cetera. So because there are all these options, I think it's important to keep in mind that technology solutions need to be developed for all of these different options. We don't know which one's going to go first, which one's going to move quicker. I think 2 years ago there was an expectation around the introduction of electric cars. That hasn't quite been the case recently, so there's some rethinking about that. There's geopolitics that are coming into play, particularly in Europe, around competition, around industrial manufacturing, etc. So these are all very complex elements. At any particular moment in time, all these things are playing and having a role in shaping policy. So as a potential supplier into the industry, we've got to be flexible to cater to all of that. And we try and do that by engaging with OEMs, final consumers, traders, etc., etc. Yeah.
I could ask these guys questions all day, so I'll ask. There's got to be some questions. Ask some questions up the back. Thank you very much.
Just a question for Mark. How do you see defence driving and helping drive demand for renewable fuels?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're trying to get the Clean Energy Acceleration paper resourced now, and I won't go into the values, but anyone associated with defence, there's always big money involved. One of the initiatives there is to purchase low carbon liquid fuels, but I don't see the benefit in purchasing it from overseas for it to be burnt over our skies. So I'm trying to break the mould of the Commonwealth procurement guidelines, which is what I was hinting at before. So this wasn't a loaded question either way. Because traditionally with defence, working under the PGPA, the acts and all that sort of stuff, we pay for things after they're delivered to us. So it's very hard for us to incentivise, and we can't enter into offtake agreements as well, which is something that gets discussed quite regularly with us. So we in Defence have developed this thing called the Accelerated Supply Chain. It is a program to try and think outside the box with regards to procurements and so on, and certainly that's being fed into that. Can we have a loophole in the Commonwealth procurement guidelines to incentivise offtake agreements, to incentivise investments? We have been involved with grants with companies as well, and Licella is one of those. Yes. And certainly, so we're doing our bit as best we can, but we're in the business of war fighting. So therefore, we are trying to work with our industry partners to incentivise the demand. But I do see the irony in that, because we do come to a forum with quite a large budget. So we do have, I feel we have an obligation to try and drive that, incentivise that investment as well.
Thank you. Do we have some more questions? I've got to shield my eyes. Is there another question? Somewhere? Yep, up the back, yep. Thank you.
Michael from DPI. I'm just interested in, like every speaker's really spoken about either e-fuels or HVO 100, so as a fuel substitute. Why didn't we think about using biofuels, even if it was limited to a B20 mix, as a way to because we've got production here in Australia already. I think there's 3 biofuel producers here. I know there's limitations with OEMs, but I'm just interested in what the panel thinks about that.
I'm happy to take part of that. Look, in relation to the question to OEMs, I mean, we've done a lot of work with our engine manufacturers, our main engine manufacturers. It's fair to say that we've had to bring them along on the journey, particularly with FAME. And we've now got to the point where we can use B20, B80, even B100, depending on the type of engine. So the newer types of engines, we're actually certified to use B100. It's not just the OEMs. We also have to deal with the local fuel certification standards and also the maritime regulator in that jurisdiction as well. In terms of why we haven't used B20 here in Australia or even B100 here in Australia, we were looking at trials of both B20 and B100 last year. We were looking very closely at it. We'd done a lot of the engineering work to do it. We'd even purchased some spare parts in anticipation of fuel pumps and things potentially blowing up. But it eventually just came down to cost. The cost of doing the trial versus the benefits, and could we sell it through to customers. We'd basically proven that we could use it in overseas in commercially viable trials. So the decision was made that we wouldn't do it in Australia until we could find a customer willing to pay.
From a defence perspective, it comes down to the whole supply chain. So we have to think about how it's tactically deployed as well, and how it's moved around, whether it's in a large auxiliary oil replenishment ship or how it's moved across the shore. So we pump fuel across shores into islands and bits and pieces like that, so how that interacts with other fuels as well. So when we reworked our standards about 3 or 4 years ago to account for FAME, and it really did cut down how we can multi-product pump through single pipelines. So it came down to some of those tactical effects as well, and how readily available it is around the country as we move. And it's the Army that I'm thinking about with regards to biofuels. The Navy can use it to a bit as well, but it's availability and how that sits. You know, a auxiliary oil holds 8.5 million litres of fuel. So how long that sits in there for as well to manage that.
Great, thank you for that question. We have another question down here. Thank you, yes.
Good day, thank you. I'm Ken from New South Wales DQ. My question's directed at Mark as well. You've talked a lot about renewable fuels and the benefits and the tests and things you're doing there. On the other side, are you also looking at the increased electrification of vehicles or equipment that you guys use to just overall reduce the amount of fuel that you...
Yeah, certainly. So all of Defence's white fleet vehicles, so you'll see Toyota Camrys, Land Cruisers and bits and pieces cutting around with Defence plates. They'll be electrified by, I think, the end of 2026. Don't quote me on that, but that's already started. Now we have an electric vehicle charging problem, so you can see it's all linked up. With regards to tactical vehicles, I know the US Army have put some targets down for their main battle tanks and bits and pieces, but it would take a 60-tonne vehicle to well over 100 tonnes by the time you put the batteries in it. Plus there's the other things that go bang problem as well. But Army last year did some work with a Bushmaster. If you're familiar with the Bushmaster, it's about a 12-tonne vehicle, carries 10 troops, very highly used in Afghanistan. They electrified it. It worked really well. Then they had the range problem. It goes back to the common problem. It also had too much power. If you can understand, high centre of gravity vehicle, too much power. You had to deal with the safety issues as well. So it's a bit of a catch-22. It comes back down to range. So they're now experimenting with hybrid drive systems, similar to you find a lot of the cars on the fleet still have that hybrid drive system.
I think there was another question up the back, just up there as well, was there? Last questions? Any last questions? Okay, great. Everyone, could you please put your hands together for our panel? It's a fantastic discussion. Thanks very much for your time, and really appreciate all the presentations that you've made today. Please join us for afternoon tea and restocking on some sugar. Thank you.